we're going to focus on Photosystem II. Might sound a little confusing, it's the number 2, but it's actually the first process in photosynthesis. It was just the second to be discovered, so they gave it a 2. They got a little lazy. But let's backtrack a little bit here. Photosystem II. Of the light-dependent reaction in photosynthesis, which is taking place in the thylakoid of chloroplast. Whew, did you get that? So we're in the chloroplast, in the thylakoids, looking at the light-dependent reaction of photosynthesis. Alright, so let's take a look here. I've got a little diagram. Hopefully it'll help us out. So, sorry about that glare there. But, here's our thylakoid. Alright, nice and green, because we know that this is where chlorophyll is. You know, it's absorbing those red and blue lights and reflecting off green. That's why a lot of plants look green. Good, you guys remember that. I'm sure you did. And so what are we saying we're going to need? Light and water. So we've got our sunlight there. We're going to come back to that in a minute. But let's add some water to this equation. Okay, so our formula for water is H2O. H2O. We're going to put an H2O molecule right there. When water hits the thylakoid, we know our body and plants' bodies are constantly going through chemical reactions. Same thing with plants. And this water molecule is going to split. So when you split H2O, what do you have? You've got H's and O's. So that's hydrogens and oxygens. We already have oxygen. We said that was a part of our products, right? We're going to have the products of glucose and oxygen. Well, here's our first product already. So let's split this molecule. We're going to release oxygen. So because there's a bunch of water molecules going on, we're able to get O2 for our oxygen release. But something else we're going to get from that water molecule splitting is an electron. So we're going to write that as an E with the minus sign. Remember, electrons are negative charge, protons positive. So we've got oxygen released, which is great. That's why we love photosynthesis. Breathing is good, you know, we like being alive, right? And we've got our electron. Here's where that sunlight comes into play, or any light in general. We're going to stick with the sun here. And that sunlight is going to energize our electron. Alright, so this light comes down, energizes that electron. Now this charged up electron, it needs to release this energy. It needs to do something. It needs to travel, alright? So what it's going to do is travel down the electron transport chain. So we're going to bring that up here, and the electron transport chain, the ETC as we call it, something you're definitely going to want to remember. We're going to see it later on in our photosynthesis processes also. But for right now, we've got our electron traveling down the ETC, and while it's traveling down, it's going to lose energy. We know that energy is never actually lost, right? Energy is always being transferred, just sometimes in different forms. So what this energy actually does is it transfers over to a carrier protein over here. So we're going to kind of show some energy getting transported to this carrier protein. That means this protein's got something to do, right? So let's pause there before we get into the proteins. Let's remember we've got water splitting. We're releasing oxygen and an electron. The electron is charged by light. The charged electron travels down the electron transport chain. So far so good? Alright, so now we have a carrier protein with energy ready to use that energy. We know that proteins help things travel through the cells, especially carrier proteins. And so now that this is charged, it has energy to actively move things through it. Active transport, did you guys see that one coming? Alright, so we've got some protons. Remember, those are positive, electrons are negative. Protons are H+ molecules, are going to actively transport from outside of the cell into the cell. So this carrier protein is going to facilitate that active transport. And we say that it is active because it's going from a low gradient to high gradient of protons. So we've got a low gradient, just a small number of protons out here, and a higher gradient of protons in the cell. Low to high, that's going to take energy. That's why this protein needed energy to transport protons. Alright, so now we've got our high concentration of protons inside the cell, and that's giving us a very positive concentration inside our cell. We've got a lot of these hydrogen ions, right? So what that means when we have this high positive charge is that these protons, they want to release some of this energy. So what they're going to do is passively transport out of the cell. They're going to diffuse out of the cell through yet another protein. That's our other red mark here. But recall, we're going from a high to low gradient now. That's why I said passive transport. It's a lot easier to go from high to low. And so when that happens, that's going to force a phosphate to attach to adenosine diphosphate to form triphosphate. Di, you know that prefix means 2, tri, 3. So we have our protons coming out, and that is going to take phosphates that have been hanging out here and attach them to other molecules, our ADP, our adenosine diphosphate, to give us adenosine triphosphate. Alright, and that's ATP. That should sound familiar from when we discussed mitochondria. We talked about how they help in ATP production. Remember, we talked about that's the energy of the cell, so we're creating ATP here also. Let's stop and review. I know that was a lot of things at one time. So we've got our hydrogen protons going through active transport into the cell, low to high concentration. Now that we've got a very positive concentration in here, these protons are going to want to diffuse down the gradient to go from high to low concentration. Once they do that, once they release out of the cell, that forces nearby phosphate to attach to adenosine diphosphate. So we're going to add a P to an ADP, and that gives us adenosine triphosphate. That ATP is going to carry on into another process of photosynthesis, but I think we've covered enough for right now. Let's just do one more big review. Water molecule splits. Oxygen, electron. Sunlight's going to come and charge that electron, travel down the ETC, electron transport chain, charge up a carrier proton, diffuse hydrogen protons through the cell, phosphate forced to join to an ADP. We now have ATP. A lot of steps to it, but not that bad, right? You guys can get this